I welcome Mike Meriton, co-founder and COO for the EDM Council. Mike joined the EDM Council in 2015 to lead industry engagement, having been the co-founder and the first chairman of the council. Mike.
Thank you, Carol, and welcome everyone. So why are we here today? In these challenging times, many organizations are rapidly pivoting business models to reduce costs and better serve end customers. At the same time, there are exponential increases in new data assets, along with significant opportunities to leverage cloud and analytic capabilities. The recently released 8th component of the EDM Council DCAM Best Practice Framework has added a new component for analytics management, bringing to life the interconnectedness between data management and data analytics. There is also a growing demand for the industrialization of data and analytics capabilities. However, scalability, flexibility, data governance, and quality remain huge challenges that firms are looking to solve in parallel. This has led to this panel discussion, which is entitled How to Build Data Analytics at Scale. To further set the context for today's panel discussion, let me introduce our first panelist for today. Werner Stender is the UK Head of Applied Analytics with Capco, with over 10 years of experience working on data-related projects across investment banking, retail banking, wealth, and asset management. Prior to Capco, Werner worked for Accenture AI, EY, and Bradesco, a leading Brazilian universal bank. Welcome, Werner, and over to you for more context on today's panel.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, welcome everybody. So as Mike mentioned, very delighted to be here today talking about analytics at scale. The webinar today is going to be more conversational than a one-way presentation. We're going to be very interactive. So please do submit your questions and we're going to pick them up at the end during the Q&A time. First thing we're going to cover is just to put everybody on the same page on what we mean by analytics at scale. So what are the main components? Why is this important now? And how do we plan to measure effectiveness of it? Because we're going to touch briefly on that when we talk about DCAM, the 8th component of analytics that has just been released as well. And then we're going to start the discussion with our panel, where we're going to do the introduction a little bit later, but they're going to address some of the burning questions that we have prepared for them on analytics at scale. But please do also submit your own questions, your comments, and we're going to pick them up at the end. So without further ado, let's get started with analytics at scale. So let me start by framing what the problem is and a few of the considerations that we have. So big data is here to stay. It's the present, it's not even the future anymore. So analytics is going to be key to exploit this data and generate benefits. And this is across financial services, but any other industry as well. So the main challenges after these many years remain exactly the same, which are around how to go beyond proof of concepts, MVPs, and productionize models and scale them. How to deliver at scale sustainably, how to make the cost manageable in this model. And then also how to manage data quality, which is one of the biggest problems in analytics at scale. We're not only making decisions faster in a more automated way, we run the risk of making the wrong decisions faster in a more automated way. So data quality is very important in this analytics at scale discussion as well. Part of the solution is considering how analytics, data science, data engineering, some of these complementary data skills fit within the short and long-term objectives of your organization. So not thinking only about hiring the latest PhD data scientists, but how they fit in the organization. Are you ready to use their skills? Then there's a play about the operating model. So are you set up to succeed in terms of automation, collaboration, agility? And then when you build some models, when you build analytics, are you setting up it in a way that's modular, that you can reuse, that you can scale, that you can leverage the benefits of what you're building to other use cases as well, rather than becoming a one-off piece of analytics? So this is part of what we're going to be talking in more detail today during the panel. But I also would like to highlight early on some of the benefits that we see for analytics at scale. So as I mentioned on talking a little bit about the solution, so the usability of the capabilities of the assets across multiple different use cases have a very good network effect on compounding benefits for analytics. Then delivering use cases fast, failing fast, and moving on reduces the marginal cost of creating new insights and generating new ideas for your business. Then analytics, as it becomes more automated, more scaled, there's an opportunity for it to be embedded in all aspects of the business. So it becomes easier for all of the business stakeholders to be more data literate and democratize access to data and insights. And last but not least, what most people see as the end goal for analytics is unlocking the full potential of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and other types of analytics, which plans to revolutionize the way every industry works. So analytics at scales pretty much unlocks that. Moving on to the next slide, on this one, we are changing the paradigm of cost-benefit relationship for analytics use cases. So on the left-hand side there, we have the normal cost-to-benefit ratio, where we have some low-hanging fruits, some no-brainer use cases, some investment cases, and some things that are too uneconomical, too expensive to address. And if you treat each use case in isolation, it's going to be very difficult for you to implement analytics at scale. So the proposal, the secret of it is to shift this cost benefit by linking and finding the interdependencies of these use cases. And when you develop an asset, a model, a data set, can be a skill or a tool, you can very easily map that to other use cases. And then this network effect of benefits start making it easier to deliver the next use case. And then it makes it easier to deliver the following use case. So when you link up the use cases in this way, you start shifting the cost benefit of these use cases to the left-hand side of this curve, and you deliver more benefits with less costs, and it's easier to scale. So it's very important. I'm not going to read line by line on this, but we have some tips on how to make that happen. So you have to have scalable analytics from the acquisition to the refining data up to the end. Engineering is a big part of it. Then you have to understand the relationship between the use cases. There are a few different ways you can do it. The way we usually see a lot of success is using knowledge graphs, which is not exactly simple to set up if you consider too many different aspects, but it can inherit a lot of benefits if you do it right. Then one of the points that I mentioned on the previous slide is creation of data assets or different components that can be modular and can be used for different purposes. So data assets, as the slide says, are created, joined, enriched data sets. They enable scaled analytics, repeatable insights, and they pave the way for things like data monetization, data commercialization as well, which is a big topic, especially in financial services at the moment. So how do you even go about creating data assets and creating these different components that you can use to build analytics and scale in a more sustainable way? First, you have to start with prototyping. You establish trust in the data that you have. You deliver quick wins as much as possible, and you start experimenting with the technologies, with the different techniques and the data sets, see what's feasible, what's possible. Then once you see and prioritize some of the use cases that you see have value and then can bring some benefits, you start defining and creating the model for it. So it's very important, and I cannot stress this enough, to create a very robust data logical model and data glossaries, because without the common definition, it's very difficult to scale the data transformation and the data engineering aspect of analytics. Then once you've gone through that step, you start building the data assets. So you identify all the different technologies that you will need to build the data pipelines. You integrate the data, you transform the data as needed, you model the data, and you start building that automation on your data warehouse, data lake, or whatever data store you use. Then you start iterating agile methodologies until the solution is completely fit for purpose. You govern it to make sure that you have proper data governance, a target operating model that caters for interaction with the business, constant feedback. You have proper roles and responsibilities. It's very important to think about not only delivering data assets and analytics at scale, but thinking about what happens on day one, what happens on day two, after you deliver the use case, who is going to sustain it, who's going to take care of it. And in some cases, if you're using, especially if you're using customer data, you have to consider governance around data ethics, data privacy as well, and uphold regulations and the customer trust in you. Desirable outcomes for some of the data assets, relevance, it needs to meet business objectives. So it's very important to always stick back to what the business wants and needs for short-term and long-term goals. Back-end value, often you're going to see the data assets deliver not only the benefit of the use case, but it's going to reduce data duplication, duplicative data acquisition, and it's going to generate insights that can be repeated and enriched value. So use cases can be compounded, as I mentioned earlier, on network effects. You can reuse the data assets for different use cases, and it paves the way for a very hot topic at the moment, which is data commercialization. So with assets, it's very easy to industrialize some of these insights and data products so you can monetize your data to external customers or even internally as well. Cool. Now I'm going to hand over to Mike back again to speak a little bit about what's the importance, Mike, of making data management linked to data analytics and make this work for analytics at scale.
Thanks, Werner. In our recent 2020 global benchmark study, we identified as one of the key questions that today 52% of CDOs are now responsible for both the data supply chain as well as providing analytics. In response, the EDM Council launched a global work group earlier this 2020 with a dozen member firms across geographies and industries to build out the best practice capabilities for analytics. This good work was published last month in October. You'll see on the left side of this slide the original 7 components of DCAM covering the data supply chain. On the right side are the new 7 capabilities for the new 8th component for operating a comprehensive best practice analytics. These 7 analytic capabilities are backed by 30 sub-capabilities underneath that firms can now use to scorecard their analytics best practices. And you'll see this contemplates everything from your data architecture to your models, and ultimately the culture and the education of your team. So thank you, Werner, for helping to set the stage. Let me now introduce the rest of our panelists. First, Chris is a partner in the UK and leads for Capco's UK data practice with over 15 years of experience in financial services, specializing in leading the design, mobilization, and running of CDO and DMO functions with tier 1 financial firms. Prior to working at Capco, Chris was with Deloitte and Goldman Sachs. So welcome, Chris. Good to have you on the panel today. Next, Paul McDonald. Paul is Global Head of Data and Analytics at HSBC's Global Banking and Markets. Paul has over 20 years of experience in data and analytics and held roles as Global Risk Chief Data Officer, Global Head of Cloud Services, and Head of Innovation. Prior to HSBC, Paul held leadership positions at UBS and EY. So welcome, Paul. Good to have you on the panel. And Hani Chaudhry is the Chief Data Officer at Aldermore Bank, heading up advanced analytics, data governance, and digital marketing. He also sits on the GLIFE board and is the chair of the GLIFE Risk Committee, which was established by the Financial Stability Board in June 2014 to drive the LEI, which is the Legal Entity Identifier Initiative. Previously, Hani held the first Chief Data Officer role at the Bank of England. Other roles include senior data positions at HSBC and Deutsche Bank. Hani also has the distinction of being a leader in the EDM Council work group that we mobilized earlier this year to build out the analytics 8th component. So welcome, Hani, and good to have everyone on the panel. So let's get going on to the questions. And Hani, I will give you the first go on a question, which is, why is analytics at scale important now, and what is the importance of following best practices? So over to you, Hani.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Really excited to be part of the panel. just to give a bit of history and context to this, because it was way back in, 29th of October 2019, Mike, when yourself and the EDM team paid me a visit. And I always enjoy our conversations because it's always, good to get insights into what's happening in the industry, and support and thoughts from my perspective as well. I talked to Mike and the team about the new data strategy we were embarking on, and actually the need to really benchmark where we are, where we are from a group perspective at Aldermore, and the maturity we're trying to attain. And of course, by heading up governance side and analytics, the governance side, we're fairly comfortable. DCAM covered that, right, to Mike's point around the existing components. But then the analytics was more difficult, right? And it's a very important part of the strategy, of course, because I always think about the chief data officer role being, it's great to be able to carry the carrot and the stick, so to speak, to be able to kind of set the policies, the standards, but actually also figure out how you do better analytics. So, in that meeting, we had a lot of discussion, and kind of pitched this idea saying, should we extend the model? I thought they're going to tell me go away, but actually, took it on board, and then had lots of conversations with Colin and set up the working group at the EDM Council with lots of great participants as well from many banks and institutions as well. And here we are today, and it's so really exciting because to me, it's so good for the industry, for the chief data officers who are going to be using this to really drive best practice. We're a small community of data practitioners, and through the EDM Council, through best practice, by mapping out the journey, it's so much easier to get funding, go to board, approve the strategies, and really kind of start a journey where you can demonstrate the benefits, right? And demonstrate, based on your peers and comparisons to the industry, where you are. So to me, it's so fundamental. And why this is important is because many organizations, fail at analytics because they embark on it and they want to do more and more of this stuff. But actually, if you don't do it in a way that's scalable, to the point Werner made earlier as well, right, is taking it through the life cycle, people are going to fail on this, and it's not a good place to be. So really pleased to be here and really seeing this through. I encourage everybody to have a look at those, at the 8th component, the 7 sub capabilities, and their interpretation, which I know we'll talk through a little bit more in detail. So back to you, Mike.
Now, hey, Hani, thank you. And I wouldn't let this webinar go further without, again, thanking your leadership in the early days of getting this off the ground. We were just receiving the early benchmark reports, picking up that focusing on analytics was vital, and you helped lead the charge and also helped develop some of the initial strawmen so that we could get the work group kicked off and running. So that's great. Hey, Chris, would you like to add to this question?
Yeah, I mean, I might reframe it a little bit and say it's always been important. I think it's imperative that we scale analytics right now.
Exactly.
Exactly, and it's an interesting one that the industry is tackling a number of big challenges around how to become more client-centric, how to deal with risks, and we're in a COVID world right now where just understanding which customers are likely to fail mortgage payments or rental payments, or even to think about concepts like is credit contagious in an economy, those need analytics. And analytics is going to be the bedrock of where, my personal belief, firms need to evolve to as they move into that kind of more client-centric, insight-driven, particularly the retail sectors where, clients want this balance of, bespoke products, but they want to respect privacy. All of that is going to be driven by analytics. And I think that's going to be imperative to the success of firms. Why best practice? I mean, for me, it's quite simple. Scale is built on best practice, because best practice leads to industrialization. Industrialization leads to scale. Without some sort of best practice, we are, we're like shepherds trying to deal with a flock going in all over the place. And I think that's going to lead to an escalation in cost in analytics, not a scalable, marginal cost reducing platform, which is what we firm believe is the right way to do this. So best practice is going to be fundamentally that industrialization leading through to scale.
Great, thanks, Chris. Moving to the next question, because this will be a series of questions, which is, what are the key tools, technologies, and techniques which unlock analytics at scale? Paul, do you want to take a shot on this question?
Sure, thanks. Hi, everybody. So I think just building, there's probably two parts to my answer. I think the first part is just building on what yourself and Hani have just said about sort of life cycle. I think of this as a sort of supply chain. Analytics is at the far end of that supply chain, and a bit like water moving through a pipe. You're not going to get a massive outflow of water coming out of that pipe if actually upstream it's still a trickle. So that piece around being able to source data at scale, make sense of data at scale, and then provision data safely at scale, I think is equally important than just the far right-hand side. So I think we need to be thinking about how do we use tools to govern our data, make sense of our data, understand our data, and then ensure that the right people get access to the right data. Because if you're looking at scale, you're looking to democratize this, you will find that many end users have different access rights or different requirements from the data. So we need to be able to support that. And then if we do a bit of a drill down into analytics itself, so the far end of the supply chain, I think that's when we need to be thinking about how do we tailor our offerings depending on who the sort of analytical end user is. We can clearly provision far more advanced analytical tools to the sort of skilled data scientists. But again, thinking about how do we democratize this, you want to be looking at things such as auto ML around how do you actually allow the less sophisticated users able to access analytics as well, almost to the point that it becomes so prevalent, such as like Excel and so on. They're able just to do their own analytics, but that does require getting access to that data safely before they can do that.
Great answer. And Paul, to me, the analogy you made of a pipe from left to right, and that the analytics coming out are only as good as the quality and breadth and scale of the pipe itself. So outstanding. Chris, I think this might be an area you have a few more thoughts on. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that analogy is great, and I 100% agree. And I think the rise of the citizen data scientist at the end, and what does that mean for tooling, is going to be really interesting. I mean, if I called out two kind of foundational blocks, one is, as we bring this data together, particularly in that kind of pipe view, is how are we entity resolving and curating those data sets? I think that's going to be really key, particularly as we are dealing with legacy estates and we're not building in greenfield. So we're going to have to deal with that. I think that's going to be really key. The second part of that is the streaming data quality elements. I think there is a lot of old thinking around data quality predominantly being a construct of the validity of does it look okay? And I think more smarter tools, particularly around statistical profiling of quality, are going to play a really big part on refining that data. And the only thing I would say is probably not one for today, but one for the near future, is the thinking around how do we deal with the paradigm of cloud and multi-cloud, and the kind of continuum problem of, localization, like where should the data physically reside, privacy, can I actually see it, and ethics, should I be able to use it, as a kind of continuum problem for sourcing. I think building the right kind of ontologies and tooling around that for the acquisition of data, so it's tagged with the right constraints to enable end users to not only use the data, but understand the limitations of what they can use it for. I think that's going to be really important. Probably not one for now, but we're not a million years away from what is going to probably be a very confusing multi-cloud world for many organizations that we're going to have to navigate.
Chris, you raise a really interesting point, which is, and I'm going to play off of what Paul raised, which is you need a very trusted supply chain of data that can be used on a safe basis. And of course, one of the great enablers is a multi-cloud opportunity, whether you're working with Amazon or Google or Azure or IBM. And recently, the council actually formed a work group. Capco is actually helping us with it. It's the largest one we've ran live to date on cloud data managed best practice. It's in midstream right now. And it has, believe it or not, 60 companies and over 200 people involved. And the hope is over the course of the next remaining months, we'll be publishing a new framework that extends the DCAM structure into cloud to accelerate safe provisioning of data. And one of the big things tackled, Chris, as you know, is cloud interoperability. How do you get the cloud catalogs to interoperate across the major providers? How do they exchange metadata and then properly manage that data supply chain going forward? So that's awesome. So I guess on to our next question here, which is, this is a tough question because people don't like to talk about mistakes. So what are the biggest mistakes firms make when they start the journey to scaled analytics? And Paul, if you want to run on this one first, that'd be awesome.
All right. I think the answer to this probably depends on where you are when you start your journey and what type of firm you are. I would imagine large enterprises potentially have some different challenges compared to the sort of small, nimble sort of startup companies in terms of large enterprises they're not short of data. The data is everywhere, and therefore the problem is, where do you get, what is the data you get from, and trying to make sense of that data and so on. So I think this is a slightly nuanced answer depending on who you are. My experience of large enterprises is, I think absolutely you need to be laser focused on business value and not to get distracted by sort of, for want of a better word, sort of sexy projects which might not be as valuable, but they might be headline grabbing. And again, you'll probably find there is a lot of easy wins that you can pick up. And what that does is it allows you to build a reputation and credibility as you start this up. So I would say, don't get distracted by the sort of bright and shiny stuff. Don't go all on some large strategic project that might take many months to deliver. Think about how you do the sort of nimble pieces, and really picking up on what Werner said at the start is, how do you spot those interconnectivities between your deliverables? Because you really want this to snowball. Every single thing that you deliver needs to make the next piece that you're delivering easier. So get out of the habit of building things in isolation and start thinking about, how can actually I begin to build synergies from each one of my deliverables.
Good advice, Paul, and into the basics of doing the right thing. Chris, would you like to add on to Paul's thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I always look at this as the first and last mile problems. So the first mile is getting going, and we can be rich in things to get doing, but not knowing the thing to actually achieve or how to get moving, and that can be culturally, difficult, particularly with some organizations which are quite slow to move, and I think that can be difficult. For me, the last mile is the most interesting one, is converting POC insight to actions. And many organizations we work with are very rich in insight in PowerPoint, and they're really rich on knowing that their customers do this in PowerPoint, or which customers are likely to leave, but actually following that through to embedded change in a process. And I think the problem I think most people think at, as they think about analytics, as a skunk work data science project, and forget that it is actually a very complex engineering problem. And you need to engineer the acquisition, which we've kind of covered already, but you also need to engineer how that then interacts with the BAU, because that's how you really realize benefits. Value, I mean, it's painful because I'm a consultant, so obviously we do a lot of this, but value is not PowerPoint. Value is change to a business.
Mike, it's worthwhile adding to Chris's point there, actually something very interesting that Paul mentioned as well. I think in terms of the data kind of life cycle, I think people shouldn't go in with the expectation that it has to be perfect to be useful. I think it's about understanding the limitations of the data. So, because so much of this is about external data sets. There's so much you do internally, but actually lots of the great insights are when you can capture external data about market conditions, and that's never going to be perfect, right? But understanding the limitations, if you look at the DCAM, the data quality pieces, it's all about understanding, describing the coverage, the conformity of this data set. If you expect perfect data, you're never going to get started, right? But actually understanding it, understanding the percentages around the data quality, metrics, I think is really quite key. But you can get lots of benefit without perfect data, as long as we understand it, of course. I'd be the strongest advocate of, data quality, of course, right?
Hanny, I've often heard the expression recently of data quality fit for purpose. Do you want to just comment on that phrase?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what it's all about. To me, I always as well say, to add to that, saying, well, from many people's perspectives, somebody looks at this data, says it's very poor, somebody else looks at it saying it's fantastic, right? Because they're looking at it from their own perspective. It's the same data 2 hours later, you could argue is poor quality because it's not been updated for 2 hours, right? But to somebody who's doing a monthly report, that's fantastic. That's all they need. So, absolutely to your point is, what's fit for purpose, and actually communicating that is also, and making sure it's part of the metadata that accompanies that data and use, to Paul's point around that chain, I think is really important, so people know what it is they're consuming and using, right?
So
Yes,
Hani, let me carry on with a question for you, which is, what is the importance of aligning business objectives to the scaled analytics roadmap?
It's such a leading question. It's so fundamental, right? It's so fundamental. When we knocked up the straw man, the 8.2 is aligned with business and data strategy, right? Because, to the point, the other question you raised earlier around mistakes, right? Common mistakes is, we hire a bunch of data scientists, they try to get access to data, try to do stuff with it. To me, it starts so much with seeing where the business wants to go and actually flipping it. So then you're saying, all right, then the exam question becomes, how am I going to support this business objectives? What data do I need? What data do I have? What data do I need to purchase, right? And get externally, what open data is available to help through the business objectives? Because the more you're tied into business objectives, the better the funding is going to be, right? The more long lasting it's going to be. To Chris's point as well, is then determining how to embed it is another not so trivial task, right? It's great to find analytics, but embedding them is also another thing we need to think about in the maturity as well.
Great. Chris, would you like to add to Hani's comments?
I agree with Hani. It's such a leading question. I guess we're not judged by the success of how interesting our findings are. We're judged by how much they help us achieve goals. And those goals don't have to be the same for everyone. Sometimes they're client-centric, sometimes they're cost-based. But if we're going to buy into funding, we need to hit those business objectives. I think the way we talk about it, half jokingly, we often refer to the Maslow hierarchy of data needs, and we stick analytics at the top and the business needs at the top, and we like to build downwards. But if you hang on business objectives, it allows you to take a slither through all of that and go, well, okay, these are the analytics programs, this are the platforms I need to build, this is the data I need. It helps you build in a very curated way, which is targeted and aimed. So everything you'll, over time, adding data sets to that platform, building the op model around that platform and scaling it, all laser focused at achieving things for the business. I think we all know a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago, CDOs may have had a bit of a bad name because they were reg focused. And you don't want to be in a position where you've got a large budget on your head, which isn't linked specifically to an outcome. And in analytics, we have a really clear opportunity to be laser focused on, yes, this is the money I'm spending. Yes, it might be large, but here's all the business benefits. Really clear on a case per case level of how that is delivered, and curate the capability as those objectives evolve and change. I think that for me is just, as Hani said, it's an absolute leading question.
Hey, Chris, and by the way, often it's a big world. How many things can you do simultaneously? Where do you focus? I think your point is pick a very clear, defined business opportunity, get stakeholders to rally about it, and then deliver the stack that's going to get that result. But do it in a way where you're creating a repeatable process, and that is the beginning of scaling. But the way to get the most support is to have business users feel they're getting value out of the analytic opportunities. So with that, I guess we're on to that question of scaling an operational scale. So let me frame the next question, which is, what kind of operating models and ways of working are needed for scaling analytics? And Paul, do you want to start first on that question?
Sure. So I guess building on what you guys have just been discussing there, you start with a business outcome is absolutely essential. Going back to that piece around thinking about this as a supply chain, is you want that supply chain to be as integrated as possible. So in my experience, the most effective way of doing that is to use multidisciplinary discipline pods to deliver. So rather than having for example, if you work your way through the sort of life cycle we spoke about, a team that tries to source the data, and then a team that tries to make sense of the data, and then a team that does the analytics, and then potentially a team that builds a sort of application front end. You want to bring all those people together into a single delivery structure, which faces off against that business outcome that you've agreed with your sponsor. So you get your funding from your sponsor for that business outcome, and you bring everyone together, and that just gets rid of the sort of challenges around things like book of works don't align, prioritization problems, and so on. So I think there's definitely something there about structuring yourselves into pods. Also want to give thought to the use of chapters. So that's something I've seen working very effectively. So you have, if you think of pods as verticals, you have your chapters which kind of transcend all of those pods. So you might have a data science pod, a data analyst pod, and so, a data science chapter and a data analyst chapter. And you have a chapter lead which enforces consistent standards across those pods as well. And that's just a great way of ensuring that as you scale out, you're not deviating from best practice and so on, and you're really learning. And I guess the final piece I would say is the other benefit of pods is you can kind of raid a couple of people from each pod and create a new pod immediately, rather than going out to the market and hiring a brand new pod. You just take a couple of people from each pod. Those pods that you've taken from will recover reasonably easily, and then you've got a new pod ready to go straight away. So you're not waiting to mobilize with fresh people. You're always bringing that cross-fertilization of knowledge together. That's what we've seen as being some of the most important things in success.
That's a great insight, by the way, Paul, the idea of pods, which you bring together the collection of cross-discipline to solve a problem. But then you have chapter leaders that cover each of the major functions that are going to be necessary. So you have consistency. So you get the benefit of sort of an agile approach along with leaders within each of the core disciplines. So that's really good feedback. Hani, would you like to, you're out there, you're delivering frontline at Aldermore. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great, concept, the way, Paul described it. Now, I suppose the interesting thing, and I think, I frequently hear we're going to have, data scientists in a 30% uptick, and that's, going to increase, in the next 5 years. And I kind of believe that, but actually, maybe, counterintuitive. My view is we're not going to see such a massive increase in demand for data scientists. And the reason is because the tools are becoming really mature, right? What I mean by that is we're getting much more of this drag and drop. Now, you still have to understand the concepts, of data science and concepts of modeling. You don't necessarily have to be a data scientist to run a data science model and to create one, right? Just like, you don't have to be a SQL developer to run ETL stacks. You can drag and drop, right? So I suppose in developing, why that's important is when you think about developing an operating model, right? Notwithstanding the data pipeline, you've got to think about, what's happening to the skill set. You still need a centralized, high, caliber, team of PhDs, right? But actually to democratize it, we're seeing increasing number of tools in the market that help to make this, more, in the hands of the business. You need to provide them with the data, of course, and that goes back to the DCAM, all the great stuff around data becomes really important. But then at the end of it, people can democratize this, right? With the right governance. And of course, these tools as well, the other important thing around the operating model is how do you take this stuff to production? Because it's not as simple as developing a model, to Chris's point earlier, then out you go, right? You got to go, there's kind of model governance, there's ethics, right? There's how do you embed it? Do you embed it in the front line within the portals when people are talking to customers? Is that ethical? What's the boundaries? Okay, and so you got to think about, I suppose, the technology that's coming and how you build that operating model to scale up. I think is really important.
Thanks, Hani. This moves us to the next question, which is we've been talking about the foundational pieces to scale analytics. Now let's move into what kind of results can this bring. And so here's the question. How will scaled analytics impact the business and your customers? And Hani, do you want to keep rolling at this point on this question?
Yeah, I think we talked about this so much already. I think, in terms of the business, we got to take it in the context where, we've spoken to the business about their visions. We understand their grand vision statements. What do they do when they come in 3 years' time? What do they expect to be able to do? And opening that conversation up. So then you're kind of partnering in that capability, be it in 2 or 3 years' time. And really the impact of analytics is you enabling the business. Now, it may not be scaled analytics, it doesn't have to be necessarily scaled, but definitely, you're building those models to align to the business vision, business strategy. Definitely, will play to increase market share and make the business more successful. And from a customer perspective, we mustn't forget, I suppose, how you could, advanced analytics and scaled analytics helps, to protect fraud. Okay, we see that not necessarily for the business we're in, but for credit cards and fraud prevention, how amazing, these capabilities are. It detects, you've logged in from multiple devices and now you're five miles away. That's physically impossible, right? And so there's so much it can do to the customer and protecting the customer. So both business value and protecting the customer, I think really great use cases there.
Awesome. Paul, do you want to comment on this?
So I'd fully agree with what Hani's just said there. I guess just building on some examples. So Hani mentioned, for example, the fraud detection. I kind of think of these in sort of 3 key areas of where analytics can help our business and customers. One is, most importantly, driving improved customer service, making sure that the customer is incredibly happy with what we do. The second piece is around, can we generate additional revenue? And then the third piece is around, how do we manage our risks better? So if I start with customer service, what we want to, some examples is we can come up with far better tailored products that we can offer to our customers. We have a far greater insight into what they do, and we can think about how do we customize our products and actually predict what they need in advance. So that helps there delivering a better service. Also, as we move into digitizing our processes as well. So let's take something such as credit lending. The way that we develop our models will now be far more advanced. We get a much faster decision and so on. So again, we can speed up the customer process there. They're not waiting for days for a decision and so on. So these are the types of things that analytics can help with in that space. If we think about that clearly generates additional revenue and so on through identifying better product opportunities. We might be able to spot markets that we weren't in before, or perhaps we see a behavior in one customer that a very similar customer is not doing, and we can think about, well, how can we see how that can lead to new products or new offerings. And then again, just focusing on the sort of risk management piece. So in addition to what Hani said there about financial crime, other things, and I mentioned credit decisioning, I think the other piece is very often we use periodic triggers to do certain things, like reviewing a client's risk profile and so on. What we can now do is take all of these data points and look for triggers that would cause us to do a risk review and so on. And so moving away from that periodic review into a trigger-based review, I think is better for everyone in terms of you get a far more timely review of what the client looks like.
Paul, thank you very much, and Hani as well. An observation to share as well is that a recent study of a group of financial services firms looked at the investments as a percentage of revenue into the analytic programs to sort of determine, are they generating profits, or are they really getting value out of these programs on the revenue and generating side. And the observation was that there was a life cycle of about 1.5 years of investments, and often not really getting a return because they were sorting out, how do we scale, how do we get this to get our team to have the right culture and approach. And then for those companies that continued those investments, it became an exponential gain in profitability. So the idea for everyone in the industry is say, well, let the big guys figure it out, or I'll wait until another year or two before I make the investment. It actually is an exponential drop you're going to have in the market. And I think this discussion is all about how to minimize the churn at the first year, 1.5 years. And by scaling these capabilities, you can really generate some exciting results. So thank you for sharing all those comments. I'm going to open it up now to some questions from the audience. I will start first with a question from Dimitri. Let me just frame the question. In the pursuit of analytics at scale, how important for you and what measures do you use to compare the engineering operational complexity associated with running analytics at scale on modern cloud platforms, as it is something that may significantly impact time to insight as well as the cost to change function? Would anyone like to dive in? Chris, is that a question you'd like to take a crack at?
I mean, look, there's two elements that I don't think in the cloud, the necessary analytics changes. I think the 2 points you're trying to make here is engineering for data sets on the cloud and bringing those together when they can be, you know, different dimensions of locality to them can be very difficult. And I think ultimately, you know, we've got to set ourselves up to engineer for that in the simplest way possible, and that's by doing it by design. In terms of operational complexity, I think ultimately we've got to kind of take that away. We run the risk in the cloud environment of introducing lots of operational complexity if we don't provide the right information to the user. My personal view on that is that in reality, this should be ontology-led. With a rich ontology that describes your data, you can apply other sets of information around location, usability, and all kinds of dimensions to that to enable end users to not have to go find it for themselves. So in reality, for me, the question is slightly different. It is really about how do we engineer for this to be successful in the cloud rather than move it to the cloud and then deal with the extra complexities there. I alluded to the question that I alluded when I was talking earlier on. I think if we don't get ahead of that, we will head for a major problem. So I'd encourage firms right now to be building their analytics solutions engineered for the assumption that when we move to the cloud, we have to engineer ready for multi-jurisdictional clouds or cloud and on-prem. And we're going to have to deal with the questions around recombining that data, potentially adding masking on that data in flight, because the data doesn't need to be masked at location, but it might need to be pseudo-anonymized in flight for use. And also dealing with the questions around, do I repersist or cache that data? And all of those need to be designed in and engineered, which just is more complex, to make it more easy for the operations to kind of almost be a bit of cloud agnostic.
Great, Chris. Really good insights. Would anyone like to add in on Chris's response?
Yeah, Mike, I suppose it's interesting because we didn't touch so much upon this, but maybe just taking a step back to a question we asked earlier about tools, right? If you think about it, this is one of those disciplines where, you know, we don't know what we don't know, right? We're exploring, we're discovering. So, you know, you're going to have 10 use cases. You know, if you're lucky, right? If you're lucky, you know, one of those is going to be massive, right? It's going to generate really valuable insights, be embedded, etc. So, you know, the ability to prove use cases and throw them away in a quick and agile way is really imperative to the operating model. So you need to kind of, part of this is making sure that you have a lab environment, you know, and cloud now offers you the ability to do this sort of very quickly, very effectively, spin it up, spin it down, and segregate it from your network so you can play around with it, right, with analytics in an anonymized way, load tools, you know, give the freedom to your scientists to be exploring. And then when you find the appropriate use case and you find some interesting insights, you then go to the production work stack, right? But actually the cloud gives you two things. It gives you, of course, the ability to freedom to, you know, be it AWS, Google, Azure, gives you the ability to experiment in a cheap and cost-effective way. And then also, if you take that to a prod environment, you know, you could think of it as well as spinning up, spinning down. Although when you're in production, you're probably much more predictable. In other words, your workload becomes much more predictable. You have a monthly, you know, file or a daily file that comes in. So I think the part of the establishing, you know, using cloud for data lab actually is really valuable, I think, in the first instance, because that allows you to fail safe, fail quick, and then pushing it through your prod stack.
Thanks, Hani. Another audience question, and then we'll go to our panelists to wrap up with some key takeaways, and then we'll cover some of the housekeeping items on other resources we'll be sending all of the attendees to today. So this is a question: how do we balance between business analytics AI and customer privacy? And in brackets, it's the big brother concepts. How do you balance those two capabilities and still meet the mission of serving your customers in the marketplace. Anyone like to weigh in on that?
I can jump in on that one. So I think one of the first aspects that you have to have when building analytics at scale, especially when dealing with customer data, is setting up some guiding principles on what does your organization values say, your code of conduct, the regulations say about what you cannot do, but more importantly, what you should or should not do with that data. There's an aspect of GDPR on not having automated decision-making without consent. There's an aspect of some now European Commission regulation or upcoming regulation on data ethics. There's a lot at play that needs to be considered here. I think if you have the customer's interest, their consent, everything at heart, when you start doing these use cases that use the data, that are going to potentially lead to new revenues for your company or to benefits the customers themselves, you have less risk of breaching their trust and upholding the privacy for the long term. And I think that is irrelevant if it's a very advanced AI algorithm that's self-guiding, or if it's something that's a bit more rudimentary being done on Excel, for instance. But the principle is the same. Can I do it? Should I do it? I think you have to have those questions in mind. And also, when you start on any kind of initiatives on that, you have to have some of these guiding principles set out in advance and not think about them reactively as the use cases come in.
Exactly. It's almost not, I'm hearing, Werner, a business case has to be built. There has to be a look at the underlying data, whether or not you have the access. And then at the end are the models and how you orchestrate this going to be explainable and transparent. So if you do have any inquiries, you're ready to answer it as opposed to not knowing what happened in the black box. So good guidance. Anyone else want to add in on this question?
Mike, I would just jump in. I think one thing we've got to be really careful of is privacy and ethics obviously is the right thing to do. But what it can't be is a roadblock in innovation.
Right.
So I 100% agree what Werner's talking about. And, when we talk to our clients, we talk about benefits, knowing what an asset was gathered for and who is benefiting from an outcome of the use of that asset. But I think organizations are going to have to find a way to codify that logic so you don't always have to go to committees. You don't always have to go through governance channels, which, the worst case we've heard can be 6 or 7 deep to get approvals to do this stuff. So I fully agree with everything Werner is saying. I think the challenge I think is going to be important is the codification of those queries and storing the appropriate logic against your assets so you don't end up roadblocking innovation, because ultimately innovation is good for the customer. And we've got this really weird paradoxical situation where clients want recommendations, they want personalization in their service, but they want privacy. So we can treat them as fully private individuals and not give them the bespoke service they want. That's not good enough. So we've got to find a way to navigate that. But I'd also add to Werner, there is an outreach thing with the customers to engage them, to help them understand. My personal belief is there's an element of data literacy that is a social responsibility of financial institutions to engage with their customers, to help their customers make the informed decisions for themselves, and also understand how and why banks use their data and for what benefit and for whose benefit.
Mike, I think I can't echo enough the importance of this topic, this question, right? Really good question, because the reputational damage, right, that can lead to organizations is massive. I always say in a digital world, there's a massive shades of gray. Okay, you've got the left-hand side very clear, what you cannot do. You got right-hand side very clear what you can do. That gray bit in the middle is quite larger than people think. And you have to have the right guide rails and the right ethical framework to help people navigate that. Because it's not easy, because what's ethical to one customer may not be ethical to another, right? And to Chris's point, engaging them, right, in that journey is really important.
So listen, we're running towards the top of the hour. I'm going to ask for each of our panelists to give a sentence or two of the key takeaway for the audience as they head back into the business for the day. And we'll start first. Hani, do you have what's your takeaway if you're one of the audience members? What would you want to bring back into your business?
So I would say, element 8.2 of the framework of the maturity model that says, you want to be successful at analytics, you don't start with analytics, maybe counterintuitive, right? You start with the business, you start with a business vision, and then you dissect that and you outline, the capabilities needed to support that vision through analytics. It may be counterintuitive because people think analytics, let's start with analytics, but actually that's kind of my one very big sort of piece of advice here.
Excellent. Paul, your take?
Yeah, complementary to that, going back to my sort of water in the pipe analogy, it starts with, you want to create a drink at the far end. That's your business outcome. But you can't just focus on that far end of the pipe. You need to get the data right at the start. You need to make sure that it doesn't get polluted as it moves through the pipe and so on, if you're going to have a successful business outcome. So really be focused on what you're trying to achieve and think end to end, not just on the analytics.
Awesome. Werner, what's your takeaway?
The key thing for me is that data analytics, and specifically data analytics at scale, is more than just technology or having the right skills. Is organizing yourself in a way that you can deliver and sustain the benefits and the value, right? The operating model, the ways of working are as important as technology and having the right data. Otherwise, your efforts are going to fall short of realizing your vision.
Chris, for final remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, for me, I'm actually going to reflect back on what Paul said earlier about mixed capability teams. I fully agree with everything everyone has said, but I think for me, bringing your data analytics and scientist communities out of skunk work departments and embedding them in a mixed capability environment to give them the best chance of achieving business objectives. I mean, for me, that is just the number one thing to get this right. And yes, technology and all of that can evolve. But if you've not got the right framework of people working together, the right tools and technology are just going to be wasted. So that's the kind of key thing I would take away from this conversation.
Awesome. Well, listen, thank you to our panelists for sharing their personal views in today's panel, and also to the audience for joining in, and to Capco for sponsoring this great discussion. Everyone is going to be receiving 2 emails, one in a few hours, which will be a full recording link. Please feel free to share this inside of your organization. It's also educational for the industry, so you can email this off to any of your colleagues at other companies. We welcome that. Number 2, in a few days, everyone typed in questions. We had more than we can handle today. We'll be following up with all of the written answers. And then finally, if you'd like to learn more about DCAM, about training courses, any of the capabilities, certainly you can go directly to Capco, who's one of our great partners, or visit the EDM Council website. So with that, I'll close out today's event, do a final thank you to everyone, and wish everyone a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.